So I want to share a sad story with you. My friend is addicted. He's addicted to all kinds of silly movies. While walking on stock, he shared me a movie from a Facebook group called The Deepest Part of the Internet. And I will share with you these 10-second movies. Pay attention to what the guy in the movie does and how it ends up. And why am I showing you this? Because I think that as developers, we are sometimes trying to solve one issue, finding ourselves dealing with a much more complicated one. Just like the guy in the movie. So, my name is Shelach, and I've been working at Taboola for the last 5.5 years. I'm a team leader of a production team in the infrastructure group. During the next 20 minutes, I will share with you a process we went through at Taboola, which improved not only our reliability, but also helps us to be more profitable. I think that the concept I will go through during my lecture will be something that every one of you can learn from. So, during my lecture, I will talk about what SLA is. We'll talk about the first infrastructure we developed called the timekeeper. We'll talk about what an SLO is, and the second infrastructure called the load indicator. In order to understand the context of my talk and the example in it, I will have to say a few words about who Taboola is. So we're the leading contact recommendation company in the world, and as such, we need to provide the best recommendation for practically all of you out of billion possibilities we have. So the scale that our services are dealing with, our recommendation services are handling 500,000 HTTP requests per second, coming out of from more than 3 billion pages a day. And even though this is the scale we need to handle, the response time, when you need to return the recommendation, should be super fast. How fast? Some customers of ours are expecting us to return the response in maximum 200 milliseconds. So with this in your mind, let me introduce you to the response times that we need to return to the customer. The response is something that is defined in the SLA. So what SLA is? SLA stands for Service Level Agreement. And I'm going to use this term a lot during my talk. So the SLA breach can be really harmful. On the one hand, customer can lose trust in us and stop working with us. And some customers of ours are just blocking every response time which is longer than the SLA. So with this in your mind, let me introduce you to the top secret of Taboola recommendation flow. And it is quite simple code. I'm sure you can all understand it. And it is top secret because I don't want people outside this room would start asking themselves, why do we need 300 developers in R&D in order to develop such code? So what you can see here is actually the method of our recommendation. So we're reading candidates from the database. This is Cassandra, for example, but it can be any other IO. We are running some personalization on these candidates, sorting them, and returning the best recommendation back to the client. You can see that the developer did a pretty good job and put timeout on the read from Cassandra. Now I'll go back again to this code later during my lecture, so remember it. Now let's see what happens in the next scenario. Let's say that Cassandra has a hiccup and the response time increased dramatically. Now, the effect on our recommendation service is really bad. Sadly, you can see here that due to this hiccup in Cassandra, we have an SLA breach. Now, small hiccup in Cassandra, any IO affecting in such way on our services is something that we cannot put up with. What even more worrying is the fact that there is a timeout on the code, which the developer already did. So why this is not enough? And this is the first issue, and this is the motivation we went in developing the first infrastructure, the timekeeper. Now, the timekeeper comes to solve 3 issues. I will start with the first one. Timeouts are not enough. What you can see here in the diagram is the flow of the request for recommendation reaching our service, and it's being executed by different features like reading from Cassandra. Every time I want to execute a feature, if there's a timeout on this feature, we either execute it or skip it. Nothing fancy here. If continuing the handling of the request, there's another read from Cassandra. Again, we read in the same timeout because this is the timeouts that there is in the code. But already seen in the last slide that there is an SLA breach if there's timeout in Cassandra. So when looking on the read time from Cassandra, we can see that we read from the Cassandra really, really fast, 140 microseconds. So why this is not enough? Why timeouts are not good enough? Because this graph doesn't show the entire picture. We have to look also on the graph of this, on this graph. What we can see here is that for every recommendation request, HTTP request reaching our service, we are reading 1,500 times from Cassandra. The future get, waiting for this get, happens 1,500 times. So we'll probably guess by now that only by multiplying this number, we get the real times that we're waiting for the future get in the scope of a single request. And this is the timeouts that our mechanism should look, our infrastructure look at, and this is the timeouts that the timekeeper is looking at. So if we go back to the flow, but this time we wrap all the features with a timekeeper, that now when we need to read from Cassandra, we'll use something that called the timekeeper budget, which measures the entire time that this feature run, even if it happened multiple times, on the thread of on the single thread of the request. And only if we have enough budget left, we'll execute this code. So now timeouts are practically enough. And the second issue the timeouts handle with, the timeouts in the code are not aware to the scope of the request. I'll show you using this example. Let's say that we need to handle request. We have 400 milliseconds to return the request. We'll process the request, and reaching the stage where we need to read from Cassandra, and it took us 350 milliseconds. Timeout on Cassandra, as you already know, this is what the developer put in the code, 100 milliseconds. If we'll give it the entire timeout, we'll have an SLA breach. Now, again, we'll use the timekeeper, and the same issue, the same flow with the timekeeper on it. 400 milliseconds for the SLA, 350 reaching this point. 100 milliseconds, this is what the developer did. But due to the fact that the timekeeper wraps this feature, timekeeper aware of the timeout request, and it assigns new timeout for this feature, and we are no longer in a risk of an SLA breach. The third issue is that timeouts are not centralized, which means they are not all managed in one place. Many developers, they just write their code, putting timeouts, they like finger in the wind, and we put some timeout. But the fact that we have mechanism infrastructure at the timekeeper means that all the budgets are centralized and they are managed in one place. So what we can actually do, we can assign different budget per request, per traffic type, and prioritize traffic with higher potential revenue or different SLA per customers. Looking at this graph, for example, you can see that there's a difference between response time, which is different traffic type, and this is being managed due to different budget, and it all happens on the same server, on the same service. So to summarize the timekeeper, we saw that it calculates the feature time on the thread of the request. It takes into account the time of the recommendation, and we manage timeouts in one place. So let's see now how it integrates it into the code. You can see here that again, where we need to read from the future, during the future get, we wrap it with the timekeeper. And what happens inside is that when doing the feature get, we're either using the timeout on the original timeout the developer did, or the remaining budget that the timekeeper had, calculating the entire time on the main thread. And whatever is more strict, this is the one we're going to use. So let's see now what happens. There is again Cassandra hiccup, and the response time increased. And this graph doesn't show the response time of reading from Cassandra, but the time we skip reading from Cassandra due to the read timeout. And you can see now that the response time of our service is flat. So obviously there are timeouts here, so the quality of the response we are returning to the clients is not ideal as we want, but we are no longer at risk of a risk of an SLA breach. And the first issue of my lecture is solved. Now, I mentioned quite a lot budgets, timeout, budgets, timeouts. Those are actually defined according to the SLO. What's SLO is? Let's say that the response time we need to return to the clients is 400 milliseconds. We will set up the entire budgets of the timekeeper, so we'll aim to 350 milliseconds. So we'll have some buffer. This is internal objective of our service that we set up. So it's actually a service level objective, or in other words, this is the SLO. But reality is a bit more complicated than this, and I already told you that this is where the issue become more complicated, and I want you to pay attention for the next slide. This slide shows you the timeouts reading from Cassandra on the future get. We would expect the timeouts reading from Cassandra would be distributed evenly across the day because issues in the database happen sporadically. But this is not what we see here. So when trying to investigate it, the first place we went to look at, obviously, is the read time measured from the Cassandra service. Surprisingly, there is inverse ratio between the read time from Cassandra service and the timeout on our services. When the amount of timeout is high, the read time is better. So this is quite shocking, but I will not keep you hold. The answer is here. The next place we went to look at is the amount of recommendation reaching our service. And what you can see how is a perfect correlation. When the amount of requests reaching our service is higher, the amount of timeouts is higher. So how do we explain this? Because when the amount of recommendation reaching our service is higher, the load on our service is higher. And this pattern is due to the seasonality of our service. And when the load is higher, everything works slower. CPU is more loaded, and the time we're spending on garbage collection, it takes more time. So I think this is probably the most important thing on my lectures, that and a little counterintuitive, the fact that there are timeouts reading from Cassandra is due to load on our service and not issues on the database. Now, adding to this, the fact that not all call paths can be cut by timeout put us in a real risk of an SLA breach, especially when our service is loaded. So it brings us back to the topic of my lecture. So we realize by now that the more time we give to the request run, we produce better recommendation, we are more profitable. So setting the SLO higher, closer to the SLA, is something that we want to do. But it also riskier and put us in an SLA risk, in a risk of an SLA breach. So we must solve this issue. What we can do, first thing, the easy solution, buy more resources. We'll buy more resources, reduce load, no risk for an SLA breach. But this is the pattern of requests reaching our services, and you can see that from time to time there are spikes where the amount of requests is doubled. So we're obviously not going to buy 2 times the amount of resources. It's really expensive. So we have to build some mechanisms that will adjust the load on our service to know how to handle these issues. So buying more resources is not an option. We can always decrease the timekeeper's budget, which means decrease the SLO. Decreasing budget and increasing it makes us to have more timeouts on our system. But timeouts have major drawbacks. First thing, timeouts are go, no go. If there's no time, we just skip a feature. So let's say that our feature is something that do personalization or recommendation. Skipping this feature means we'll have no time to do personalization. We're literally losing money. And the second thing is that, ironically, timeouts are not effective in reducing load. We are trying to make an action which will not use its result. So even though timeouts, even though when our services are more loaded, there are more timeouts from themselves are not effective in reducing load. And this was the motivation to develop the next infrastructure, which called the load indicator, which proactively reduces the load on our service, and I'll explain how it does. The load indicator doesn't look at the SLA on the scope of a single request, but look at this on the scope of the entire service. It also has many indicators of what load is, and it knows in real time what is the load on our service. Now let's look at our code to understand how it does it. So we look now at the apply personalization part. The first thing we can do, just wrap it using the timekeeper, as we already did when read from Cassandra. But we already understand by now that this will make more timeouts if we need, if there's an issue, and timeouts are not effective in reducing load. So looking inside the apply personalization, what you can see is that what happens inside, we are iterating over all the candidate leads, applying personalization for each one of them. Now we want to reduce load. So what we actually do, we are deciding on the amount of candidates we'll iterate on according to the current load on our system. By doing this, we are proactively reducing load on our services. And what even more powerful here is the fact that this is no timeout and go, no go manner. So even if we are reducing load and pay the money for this reducing load, we are still not harmful as timeouts. So let's look at reality. This is SLO limit. The green line is the most important one, which is the load on the service. The purple line is the amount of candidates we are iterating on. As load on the server increased, we reduce the amount of candidates. Whenever the load goes above this line, we start reducing the amount of candidates. So as a result, the load is going down, so we can start recovering the amount of candidates whenever the load is going down. So we're actually getting a closed feedback loop controlling the load on our system. And I think this slide is the most important slide on my lecture. If I want something that you remember, I hope this one will be it. So the response time, what it says is the closer the response time, the SLO to the SLA is better. But we have a tipping point in the response time. After this tipping point, due to load on our services and garbage collection, the response time increased exponentially. So we'll set the SLO just before this tipping point. Taking this to the infrastructure I just told you about, this is without no infrastructure. We control the response time using loose timeout or strict timeout. The looser we give is better, but we still need to set the SLO just before the tipping point in order to avoid the SLA breach. After integrating the timekeeper, due to the advantages of the timekeeper, the SLO moved a bit to the right, the tipping point moved it to the right, so we can set the SLO even higher. After integrating the load indicator and controlling the load on the service proactively, the tipping point moved even farther to the right, and we can set the SLO even higher. So practically, we developed a couple of infrastructure which improved also the reliability, but also made us more profitable. And I would like to end up with a quote of Russell Eckhoff, an American organizational theorist, and he said, "A system is never the sum of its parts. It's the product of their interaction." And I think this is the most important lesson we've learned during this process, and this is the best tip I can give you. Only after learning the interaction between different parts of our services can we manipulate them to work ideally. So 20 minutes ago, I promised you that the concept I will go to will be something valuable for you. Well, I hope I kept my word.